Before we jump into today's episode of Major Pain with Preeti discussing premature birth, I have a little bit of news to share with you. First of all, extra special thank you to Trisha Schmidt, who joined Patreon this week as our brand new Patreon supporter. Thank you so much for your support of Major Pain. Trisha is a fellow MCAS patient, and I actually had the pleasure of talking with her and her husband about it recently, which was so much fun. Thank you, Trisha, for joining our Patreon community. If you are enjoying Major Pain, Patreon is one of the best ways to show your support for the show with monthly financial contributions. You can learn more at patreon.com/majorpainpodcast. Extra special thank you to our Patreon producers supporting the show at the highest tier of $25 per month: Steve Kavanaugh, Chris Fowler, Trish O'Brien, and Hipster Leia. I also have a special treat for our Patreon community. The new episode of the bonus podcast just came out. Andy and I finally had the chance to sit down and talk through our epic honeymoon. That full bonus episode is now available on Patreon. And I've been trying something new recently, making the bonus episodes available on an individual basis for purchase. If you don't want to sign up to Patreon with monthly recurring financial contributions, but you want to check out the bonus episodes to see if it's something you're interested in, you can purchase an individual episode. They are $3 each, which is the minimum that I can charge on Patreon. If you are on an Apple device, that price may be higher. Due to the way that the iOS store charges fees to Patreon directly, Patreon has had to raise their prices just for the iOS store, and none of that goes to the creator. You can avoid these extra fees by signing up directly on Patreon's website or on any Android device. There are several other great ways to support Major Pain: our affiliate programs with Rare Patient Voice and NeuroHealth, as well as our Amazon shop. You can learn all about supporting this show on our website, majorpainpodcast.com/support. I've been very busy behind the scenes, a lot of exciting stuff happening. As Andy and I announced recently, for our wedding registry, we asked people to donate to an undiagnosed disease fund to purchase genetic testing for undiagnosed individuals. The first 2 people have been chosen, and the testing process has gotten underway. Both of these individuals are interested in coming on the podcast and telling their story once we have some results. That is something I am very much looking forward to. Due to my full schedule, now that I've gone back to work, we have had to go down to every other week on our release schedule for the podcast. I've been pushing myself right up to the limit of what I am capable of each week. As someone with a chronic illness, I have to be so careful about not pushing myself too hard. And I really appreciate your understanding changing the release schedule for the show. Since this has been working for me, I'm going to continue to do so. I'm making it official. Major Pain is now a bi-weekly podcast. I actually haven't gotten any negative feedback about that, which I'm taking as a good sign. If anything, I have gotten some positive feedback from people that they actually enjoy spacing out their listenership of Major Pain a little bit, having more time to digest each episode. But of course, I am always interested to hear from you, the audience of the show. We have built something so special together over the years, and how you feel about the podcast matters a lot to me. So if you have feelings that you'd like to share, you can always reach out to me, majorpainpodcast@gmail.com. The last thing I'll say before we jump into our amazing episode with Preeti is that I am not a medical professional. Please do not take any medical action based off what you hear on this podcast without first consulting your doctor.
How lucky it is just to get through a day without pain.
If you look at me, it doesn't appear that I have a disability.
A test that comes back abnormal, it's like, yes, we're onto something here.
Welcome to Major Pain. I'm your host, Jesse Mercury, and this week I'm so excited to be joined by my guest, Preeti. Preeti, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jesse. So privileged to be here and, share my story and, hopefully have an inspiring story for our audience today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you because you were actually referred to us by a recent guest on the show, Ami, who you are friends with. Yeah. How do you two know each other?
So we actually met through, we're part of a group called Chicago Custom. I'm based in the Chicago area, and so is Ami. So they do a lot with South Asian, creative content. So we actually met up at an event, and I know she's a big epilepsy expert and, likes to do a lot of nonprofit and awareness work with epilepsy. And I do a lot with South Asian mental health as well as premature birth advocacy. So that's kind of what, brought us together and how I was introduced to her. Awesome.
Yeah, Ami's episode is amazing. It just, as we're recording this, it just came out, but this will obviously come out a little bit later. So if anyone's listening who hasn't checked out Ami's episode about epilepsy, it is fantastic. Okay, well, let's get to know you a little bit before we jump into your story today. So, Preeti, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone, just the entire audience. Hello to all of you. My name is Preeti Kalra. I work as a pharmacist in the hospital. I'm an inpatient hospital pharmacist. Been currently working as a pharmacist for 6 years now. Graduated Midwestern University College of Pharmacy back in 2018. Prior to that, did my master's in health administration and also have a bachelor's in biology. So I spent a good portion of my life in education and in grad school. So just a little bit about me, was born in the U.S., brought up in Chicago. I'm an only child, no siblings, grew up in a South Asian Indian family, and currently first generation. So my parents immigrated from India. And, just live in the suburbs of Chicago, lived here all my life, and, have a weird job, a lot of weird work hours. So, pretty busy with being a working professional. But yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Awesome. What are you nerdy for? What sort of pop culture things are you into?
So in terms of like movies, I love thrillers. I love thriller movies, that genre. Currently I started watching Dexter on Netflix. The gore doesn't bug me, but, thriller kind of action loaded genre is what I'm really fond of. And, in terms of hobbies, I really actually enjoy public speaking. It's something I would like to get more involved with. So I think this podcast is a perfect opportunity.
Oh, great.
To kind of, it's something I've always enjoyed as a kid. Yeah. So that's something I enjoy, and, love doing yoga, meditation, and really, because I'm very passionate about mental health, I try to engage in a lot of self-care activities for myself, especially being in quite a stressful job. So it really helps me connect more with the world around me.
Yeah, awesome. I just started watching the new Dexter show, Dexter Original Sin, which is like the prequel show. I've seen every episode of Dexter and the sequel series, Dexter New Blood. So yeah, I'm definitely very familiar with that world.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like shows like that, The Mentalist. I love The Mentalist with Simon Baker. Like those kind of, they just keep you, those kind of shows just keep you on the edge of your seat, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
There's something about Dexter that's so compelling, even though it shouldn't be. It's like, why do I want to watch this story about this serial killer? But
exactly,
something about the way that he's like channeling it to try to only kill bad people. And I don't know, it's a very interesting franchise. So yeah, I've seen every episode.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Currently on season 2, so I have a ways to go, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that first season of the original show is incredible. I think that might be, I think looking back, I mean, it's a great show, but I think the first season was the one that I loved the most. Although there's some really amazing seasons coming up. Anyway, I don't want to accidentally spoil anything for you, so let's get into your story. All right, Preeti, what is your major pain?
So my major pain, I can't really attest it to one thing, but if I had to choose, I think a large portion of my life, just dealing with the long-term health effects of being born extremely premature. Birth and the complications surrounding premature birth. So just a little bit, of context for our, viewers and our listeners. So I was born at 24 weeks when I was born.
Wow.
And this was back towards the end of, I was born in 89. So, roughly 35 years ago. And at that time, in NICU technology and neonatal medicine technology, the technology wasn't really up to date, right? It was, the incubator just came out in the 80s and 90s. Really, it was really very new technology at the time. And, I was a 24 weeker. I was 2 pounds at birth, so very low birth weight. And, I've come a really long way to what my beginnings were, but it was with substantial support, from my parents, and God bless them, and my extended family and everything. And so I think my major pain is kind of the hurdles and the long-term health implications of being, born preterm and being born that early in my life.
Yeah, that is early. That is so early.
Early.
What is full term? Like around 40 weeks?
Yeah. So preterm birth is classified as anything before 37 weeks.
Wow.
So they have like different categories. So like if you're extremely preterm, if you're born before 28 weeks, very preterm is 28 to 31 weeks, and moderate preterm is like 32 to 33 weeks. And then they have late preterm, which is like 34 to 37 weeks.
So you're as extremely preterm as it gets.
Yeah.
24 weeks. That's almost half of like a full gestation period. That's unbelievable. That's going to take me a second to wrap my mind around.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I have so many questions. But first of all, let's start with the present day. What are the current things that you live with? How is this affecting you as of today to have been born so extremely premature?
Mm-hmm. So in my childhood, I didn't really realize it, and neither did my parents, coming from an immigrant, like Hindu Indian family, right? But I was actually diagnosed in grad school, typically medical school. I actually got in, and they diagnosed me with ADHD and anxiety, and like a mild visual spatial, like learning deficit. And at that level, that's when I found out, but I had been coping with all this throughout my entire childhood. And so those, long-term, really mild neurodevelopmental effects came out now in my adult life. So I also struggle with like executive functioning, right? And, that's related to the ADHD, but, focusing, anxiety. So kind of the mental health aspect is what I've struggled with once I progressed into adulthood.
Yeah, currently. Interesting. What's so interesting about that is so many people live with those things who have a normal term pregnancy. Yeah. So that's so fascinating that, we're all living in this society together, and people can be walking among you that just have these elements to their story that are so extreme that you never would have even guessed. I mean, just meeting you, talking to you, never would have occurred to me. Oh, this is someone who was born at 24 weeks,
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, definitely have come a long way. So
yeah. Take me back in time. I mean, obviously this is before you're born. What do you know about your birth from your parents? Do you have any sense of why you were born so premature?
Yeah, so, I've talked to my mom about it, and she told me just her amniotic sac, her water broke early. They don't really know why, but I've done a lot of research on my own, being in medicine. I mean, now I'm in pharmacy, but, still a medical field. Like, I've done a lot of, premature research, like on premature birth on my own. I like to read journal articles. That's probably the nerdy, part of me, but a lot can cause premature birth. They've said, small uterus, compromised cervix in women. Of course, any stress factors that occur during pregnancy, preeclampsia, which is like, the umbilical cord, ripping, the umbilical cord. So a lot can cause premature birth. And of course, some lifestyle factors, right? Of course, stress, and then also smoking. So really, premature birth and the incidence cannot be pinpointed to a certain cause. But in terms of what I know for my mom is that she just went into labor early. Her amniotic sac just broke early.
Wow. She must have been so confused and surprised.
Oh, I mean,
how at 24 weeks pregnant to suddenly go into labor, I can't imagine what that must feel like.
I can't either. And, for them, and this is important to note, like my parents, they were immigrants, right, to this country from India. And, I was born in 89. And so my parents were here for maybe 2-3 years. And, it was a new land for them. didn't know English very well, like every immigrant story, right? Worked odd jobs. And then on top of that, this traumatizing, birth, right? My traumatizing birth. And I can't even imagine like at the, what they went through at the time. It just, I can't even imagine like what they went through.
So your mom goes into labor, goes to the hospital, gives birth. Were there any complications during the birth itself?
So important to like know actually. So they actually took her to one hospital in Downers Grove, which is a suburb of Chicago. And at that time, actually, they didn't even have a NICU. They weren't equipped to handle premature deliveries, premature birth deliveries. So they actually then took her to Loyola University Medical Center, which is in Maywood, Illinois. It's like a big academic teaching center. And so at that time, they had a critical level 3 NICU, a high level NICU, and that's where actually I was born. So they first took her to one hospital, but then it wasn't, they said we're not equipped to handle this. So then they had to take her to another hospital.
Wow. And she's in labor this whole time.
I believe so. Yes. Yes. Wow. I don't know exactly the specifics. I feel like I should have talked to them more about it, but I haven't. Probably, it's just, I just became busy in my own life. But I think as I've grown into an adult, I've become more passionate about the topic. So that's, what's drew me into learning more about my past and, into how premature birth can infect, individuals even beyond the NICU.
Yeah. And I'm unfamiliar with that word, NICU.
Yeah. So the neonatal intensive care unit.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously, you've discussed the fact that for you personally, there is this mental health aspect that has presented itself throughout life. But I know that there must be more possibilities for people who are born that premature. In your research, have you come across sort of the spectrum of what's possible for someone who is born that premature?
Oh, yeah. So, in my research and what's tricky about premature birth, it can impact your body in so many different ways. Of course, neurodevelopmental, but also like I actually, saw a journal article with the Cleveland Clinic Journal of Medicine. It was published in the December of 2020. It basically outlines like the hidden long-term effects of premature birth, right? So, the third trimester of pregnancy, which is before 28 weeks, or 28 weeks and beyond, that's where a lot of your organ development actually occurs. So then if they're saving babies at 24, 25 weeks, actually now they're saving babies at as little as as early as 23 weeks, which is crazy. Yeah. 23 weeks. But, it can impact so many of your body systems. And that article that I saw, it basically says a lot of these organ systems have the potential to be adversely impacted because, the organs, they don't develop optimally or, they rapidly decline because they weren't given proper time to really develop,
Yeah.
I mean, babies are in the incubator, they're watching development, but still it can't mimic the uterine environment, right? That's nature, kind of nature versus nurture, So, they found a variety oxidative stress. So for whoever in the audience who isn't in medicine, I'll just, do some vocabulary, but telomere shortening. So telomeres are at the end of your chromosomes and they determine how fast you age. So if you have oxidative stress on those telomeres at the end of your chromosomes, it can increase faster age kind of. So cause you to age rapidly.
Wow.
Which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah.
And then in the pulmonary system, it can cause obstructive disease, pulmonary hypertension, a lot of cardiovascular effect. They say preemies are, former preemies are increase of hypertension, ischemic heart disease, congestive heart failure, peripheral vascular disease. And these are all related to how hard your heart muscle has to work to pump blood. Because I read an article, they said that, you know, because the preterm heart didn't have enough time to develop, it may have to work harder, you know, and that's why, because of the lack of development, those individuals that do survive into adulthood, they may be at an increased risk of high blood pressure and, you know, congestive heart failure, you know, so definitely that's a risk factor. And then like your renal, right? Your kidneys, preterm babies, whenever you're born, they don't even have that many nephrons, which are your kidney cells in your kidneys. So your kidneys actually have to work harder to compensate for that, you know? So, so they say that adults who were formerly preemie, they may develop chronic kidney disease later in life because, you know, their kidneys were already underdeveloped, have to work harder to compensate, and this puts more stress on the kidneys.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just, I don't want to get too technical, but that's,
oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like extremely individualized about how this can affect the body. And also, it also seems like there's no way to know throughout your life how this will affect you as you get older. It seems like, you know, some of the effects to your organs might not make themselves known until you're older. So
absolutely.
So for you personally, I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you know the state of your organs? Are you constantly having to see specialists to take a look, like how's my kidney function? How's my heart function? Is that like a layer of anxiety that's sort of draped over your relationship with your own body through your entire life?
Oh, absolutely. Like, you know, I try to take care of myself, you know, be my own advocate. And this is what I encourage other people who have similar birth history to me, that be very mindful, like go for your physicals, you know, go really take control of your health, because obviously we all have to, but already when you're in a higher risk population, it's very, very vital. And, you know, in terms of specialists, I do see an ophthalmologist. So, you know, going back into, you know, what really, when I was born, what I dealt with is I was actually born cross-eyed when I was born. So, which means like, you know, I was born very nearsighted. My eyes were, you know, crossed. So I had like, my eye muscles were a little deformed. So I actually had eye surgery when I was 2 at Loyola. The pediatric ophthalmologist, he performed it. And so they basically moved my eye muscle so it seems less noticeable.
Wow.
Yeah. So I've been actually wearing glasses since I was 2 years old as a result.
Yeah. And then how about the state of your internal organs? Are you, you know, have you had anything throughout your life that has gone wrong with any of your organs that you would attribute to being born premature?
At this point, no, thankfully.
Wow.
But
I mean, that's unbelievable too.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, but you know, and this kind of goes into like, and this is something, you know, growing up in South Asian culture, right? Like procreation is such a big part of our culture. Like, oh, like, you know, every time now I'm like 35, I get that question. Oh, Preeti, like, when are you getting married? When are you having kids? But I think for me, going back to the, like a big, you know, pregnancy already puts a big burden, right? Or a big stress on a woman's body, even if they don't have any of the history that I did. But as I mentioned, there's so much unknown, right? With premature birth, the long-term implications. And that's something I really hesitate with, right? Having bio kids, because pregnancy already puts such, you know, a stress on a woman's body. So I don't know. And it pushes your internal organs, actually, you know, when the uterus expands, right?
Yeah.
So that's something I've been struggling with, you know, kind of that cultural clash, like expectations versus reality, or how I grew up, right? And what my beginnings were. So, but no, thankfully, luckily, like, besides, you know, the normal, like, watch your cholesterol, like high triglycerides. I've had issues, but nothing really related to my organs as of now, except my eyesight. My eyes are really weak, and having problems with depth perception, being very nearsighted. When I go into my eye doctor, my ophthalmologist visit, like I go to an ophthalmologist every year, and she does the yearly eye exam. And so they always measure my eye pressure in my eyes because my eye pressure is really high. And she's like, once you turn 40, we're going to be really closely monitored because if you have increased eye pressure in your eye, it can cause glaucoma. That's one of the risk factors. So, I wear bifocals. I actually had bifocals before I was 30. So my eyes, I would say physically, that's probably the biggest kind of thing I've experienced as a result of being born preterm.
How do you feel about that? I mean, you were born so early, and yet you have so far avoided a lot of the risk factors. Do you have a sense of gratitude about your daily life over that? Do you feel different from the rest of your community in that you have this sense of gratitude over the fact that your body is functioning?
Oh, absolutely. And, I have reflected a lot on this, and I do strongly think if I wasn't born in the U.S., at that time, if I was, let's say, born in India, I don't think I would have survived. Just from what I know, like, of course, because, of course, the U.S. at that time, especially, it was a pioneer in medicine, right? And there's no better country to be, born that early at that time with the technology that was available, so I really do think that if I wasn't born in the U.S. at that time, I might have not made it. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, life is surprising and fragile and unpredictable.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, okay, late 80s, you're born at 24 weeks. How do they keep you alive? What happens at that point? Obviously, they must keep you in the hospital in an incubator. I mean, what does that look like?
So from what I know, I was in the NICU for 3 months. I still have my NICU certificate, from when I graduated. But, because I was born so early, I was in a temperature kind of incubator where they really regulate your body temperature, I don't know the specifics about the different kind of incubators they have, but, so I was in the incubator for 3 months, and actually my parents have told me that when I was born, they injected surfactant into my lungs because I had underdeveloped lungs when I was born. So in your lungs, you have something called alveoli. And alveoli, that's where oxygen exchange occurs, like between carbon dioxide and oxygen, So when you have underdeveloped lungs, those alveoli may not, function properly, and you need surfactant so that they don't collapse, I don't want to go too much in detail, but so basically my parents told me that they were, asked if I could be in a surfactant clinical study because surfactant had just been introduced like the mid 80s, or around that time. And it was still fairly new in medical science. So actually I took part in a clinical study for surfactant. And I think that's really so cool. I don't know exactly which study, but they had to sign some disclosures when I was at Loyola. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So your lungs needed extra care. You're in the hospital for 3 extra months. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it would be like for your parents to not only give birth to you that premature, but then not be able to take you home, not know if you're going to survive, but then to have you pull through with all this extra care, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I think because like my mom also, like my parents, they had extended family help. Like my aunt and uncle were here. They came here in the 70s, but they both are now retired physicians. So they were actually living with her at the time because when they first came to this country. So my aunt was taking like a lot. She took care of me as well. So I think just having that family support system was huge.
Yeah.
Otherwise, having experienced traumatic birth and being in a new country, it's a lot for an individual to process, right?
Yeah, no
So,
kidding. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're a real success story. I'm curious, how have things changed since the late 80s for what they do when someone is born this premature?
Yeah, so I actually work in inpatient hospital, so in pharmacy, but I've done like peds and NICU rounds actually, like as the pharmacist when we need coverage. And so we have a level 3 NICU now. I work at a community hospital in the suburbs of Chicago, and I've seen that now they have a lot more follow up because, okay, they had the incubator obviously when I was born. They had the surfactant when I was born, but this kind of goes into why maybe I found out I was neurodiverse so late in my life because the follow up really wasn't there. When I was growing up, because in the 90s, first of all, there wasn't that much awareness of neurodiversity, of mental health. Even growing up in the US, there wasn't. This phenomena came in, I would say, like after the 90s, right? And then on top of that, growing up South Asian, like those cultural struggles, right? The cultural clash with mental health and neurodiversity. And then also in premature, birth medicine and neonatal medicine, there wasn't that follow-up. So now, when I'm reading notes, like for NICU babies that are born, when I'm covering those floors, they say pediatric OT, like there's a whole like clinical neurodevelopmental team for the baby. That care doesn't just end at the NICU level. Like when they graduate the NICU, it's through their childhood, maybe into adulthood. They have a pediatric OT to help them with fine motor skills. Like a neurodevelopmental learning specialist to help with learning disabilities the child may have or the baby may have, or, when they go into childhood to help them cope with learning disabilities and with ADHD, right? And so they really now have an extensive neurodevelopmental, because neurodevelopmental outcomes are a big portion of being, of the long-term effects of being born premature. But I think and those are kind of really the illness like that may show up in childhood and progress, and that require that extensive follow-up.
Yeah. And so what was it like for you? I mean, it sounds like the neurodevelopmental challenges have been some of the hardest that you've had to face. Mm-hmm. And when did that first present when you were a child? And then what was it like growing up with these challenges?
So, unfortunately, I was not formally diagnosed till I reached, medical school specifically. But I think I did cope with it that many years because literally when I was growing up, I was always studying. Like, I literally, even when I was in elementary school, I remember just being so anxious about assignments, and other kids used to play outside, and I used to have a lot of social anxiety, and I think because, of course, growing up in a South Asian culture, there was still a lack of awareness, and my parents didn't really understand, or they didn't have awareness, right? I had trouble with certain fine motor skills, like maybe cutting on the dotted line, right? Like when I was a kid, doing art kind of things, like hands-on kind of things were a struggle for me. And, and my parents knew that, but they couldn't attribute that it maybe had something to do with being born prematurely, And plus then I had an extensive support system with them because in our culture, like academics is so heavily emphasized. So I was able to cope with it because they were micromanaging everything and really, so I would only have to focus on one thing. But then when I went to grad school and, progressed into adulthood and, lived out on my own, that's when things got really tough because I had to manage everything. So those executive functioning kind of, issues were kind of drawn to light.
Yeah.
I think.
How did you feel about that growing up, that you were having these challenges and you don't even know why, and you just have to learn to adjust and adapt and live with it? And did that make you feel different than your peers?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of shut out. And that's how I felt with
Mm.
fellow Indian folks, you know.
Oh, wow.
So, and I had a very diverse group of, you know, friends growing up, but whenever it came to like associating with other South Asians, I hesitated because I always felt different. You know, I had social anxiety. Another thing, like still till this day, like very sensory prone, like very, you know, like I have, you know, certain loud sounds or bright lights. Like in my college years when we used to go clubbing, I almost fainted on the dance floor. My friends had to drag me out because just very, I think with the bright lights, the sound, crowds, like those kind of things, very sensory. I can feel some sensory differences, you know,
Yeah.
but I couldn't really lay my finger on it when I was growing up because again, the lack of awareness. And it was very frustrating as a child because already my parents didn't understand what was going on and, you know, constantly struggling without outside intervention. It was very tough to deal with.
Once you get to medical school and you finally get an official diagnosis, how did that come about? And was there this sense of validation? Did you look back through your whole life with a new lens of understanding?
Absolutely. I think as tough as that time in my life was, I'm not going to lie. It's like already I worked so many years of my life getting into medical school and it's no easy, you know, it's a very hard achievement. But I think in a way, I look back and hindsight is 2020, right? That's what they say. I'm actually kind of thankful too that I found out because it made like everything fell in place, you know. I always grew up with this kind of brain fog where like my brain just had to work harder, you know, whether it be like in reading comprehension or then with my fine motor skills, like just even cutting, right? Like some simple tasks like that. Or like even now, like cutting fruits is a little hard, you know. It's just whenever I used to hold something, it used to feel so weird. I can't really put my finger on it, you
Yeah.
know, but that has something to do with your hand muscles, right? And that leads to the fine motor kind of a little bit fine motor skills and struggling with it. But I think that point in my life, it really, as hard as it was, and it was, you know, very hard for me to accept, but I'm kind of glad it did bring it to light because then I could now know how I can, you know, help, like cope with it in a healthier way, you know, and really it showed a lot about me as an individual and it taught me a lot about myself.
And what triggered you to finally seek this diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was struggling academically. Like in 3 months, I went to med school in August and I failed out in October. They're like, okay, like you failed 3 classes, 3 in a row. I didn't pass a single exam. And I'm like, what is going on? You know, I got up to this point, had a real high GPA. And I think what made it kind of hard because it is a very demanding curriculum, no doubt about it. But I'm like, when you're studying that many hours in a day and you're almost passing and it's not like I was way off. I was pretty close, but I was getting frustrated. Like, what is going on? Why can't I process all this information at this speed? And that's when I found out that I was neurodiverse.
Wow. What changes in your life once you find that out?
Mm-hmm. Well, then they were letting me come back into medical school, but they said you can't fail anything else when you come back.
Wow.
And
No pressure.
that was no pressure. And that was a very, very tough decision for me because I had to really evaluate, you know, medicine is a very visual subject, right? And then on top of that, having this like mild spatial kind of learning deficit that I was diagnosed with. Again, it's mild, but at that level, it was posing a problem. Then I'm like, okay, is this really a realistic career goal for me, right? Because it's a very, you know, the human body is very spatial and medicine's very spatial, right? So I'm like, realistically speaking, now that I learned all this about myself, is this really the career for me? So I decided not to go back but I look hindsight, like pharmacy is a great field for me. I love it. And it's just more catered to my interests and like my strengths, because I loved math growing up, and pharmacy uses a lot of math and calculations. So, I look back and I'm like, that wasn't the career fit for me, but it also taught me, I think they say, right, and everything in life happens for a reason. And I think for me, maybe that drawback happened, but it showed me a lot about myself. And then, I could really introspectively like work on those skills, because now that I know these diagnoses, how can I further work on myself to better and help like cope with these things in a healthier way?
Yeah, I mean, that can really do a lot for your self-awareness to be diagnosed with anything. I mean, we've talked a lot on this podcast about the importance of a diagnosis, especially for someone, for any sort of person. I'm someone who went undiagnosed with a chronic illness for most of my life. Having that diagnosis has completely changed my life. And just when you're dealing with a body and it's doing something you don't understand, and you're kind of running up against a wall over and over and over and over your entire life, and you don't know why, and then you finally get a label that you can put on it, and that label comes with like all these instructions. It's like an instruction manual for your body that you've never had. It's life-changing. It's completely life-changing. So when you were in medical school originally, which field did you want to go into?
So when I was in med school, I mean, it was just so preliminary, but I'm like neonatology, right? Obviously, especially in my medical school, like admission essays, I wrote that I was preterm, and that medical advances saved my life, right? And that was my personal story behind it. But, going into, I think, NICU medicine, if I had gone all the way, that would be coming up full circle. But, now, even as a pharmacist, I have the privilege of going on NICU rounds, and, we do TPNs for NICU babies. And even though maybe I'm not exactly directly involved in diagnosing them, I am involved in their care. So, I kind of put a positive spin on it that, okay, that wasn't the path, but it's come to a full circle that I am giving back to the NICU community. And I'm very privileged.
That's amazing. Yeah. And you found the path that works better for you.
Yes.
And, we live in a culture that's very, follow your dreams centric, but oftentimes what you think you want is not what you need. And then life will take you in a different direction, and it can feel like, oh, my dreams have been taken from me. Or it can be, hey, life is taking me to this other place, and I can still have the life that I want to have, even if it doesn't look like what I imagined it would look like. It can still be just as fulfilling, if not more so, because you're living more in alignment with what your particular body needs. When did you start developing this desire to advocate on behalf of the preemie community? I mean, something I was so excited to talk to you about today is just, we've been emailing back and forth a little bit, and I know how much research you've done on this topic, and I know that there must be sort of something missing in how this topic is being talked about at large, and because I know that you're working really hard to try to fill in some of these gaps. So when did that happen? When did you decide to start going into advocacy?
I think after I graduated pharmacy school, and, really the turn of events was when I found out very late in my life that I was neurodiverse. I would say that's really the turning point. But I really got involved in advocacy efforts, I think, after working in the hospital and then working on, with the NICU babies, like on a daily basis, like through the pharmaceutical care. And then, so after I graduated pharmacy school, I became more involved with March of Dimes. So they're a nonprofit organization in the U.S. That they advocate for maternal health and for preterm birth, because it's a big crisis in our country. Like they say 1 in 10 babies born in the United States are preterm. 1 in 10. Yeah. That's a lot. So I'm on the associate board with them, with the March of Dimes. We do a lot of, community service with the NICU, with NICU families. So that's kind of what sparked my interest. And then taking it further because, I feel like, of course, A, growing up in a South Asian community, that lack of awareness, and B, just because now really premature babies are surviving well into adulthood, like me and maybe generations a little bit before me. And now really studies are coming out, okay, what are the really long-term effects into adulthood of prematurity, you know?
Yeah.
And if my story can help anyone, like someone whose parents may not be aware if the child is doing okay in school, but they don't, when things are going okay, but still the amount of work it took to get here was astronomical for me. A lot of sweat, a lot of tears. Yeah, I was able to make it because I had such an extensive support system as well. And that was key. But if it can be identified earlier, then it can save the kid or even the adolescent a lot of grief a little later, right? And, they can better compartmentalize their life.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the big goals for you is for the parents of premature babies to be aware of the developmental challenges that some of these children might face, and maybe be, looking into these things or screening the children. And I mean, what are the specifics that you'd want to share with any parents who have premature children? Are there any guidelines for screening that you'd recommend, or just any gaps in general knowledge that you'd want to fill?
I think obviously when you're a child, right? Maybe the organ system, you won't know because they're young, right? But I think first and foremost, the neurodevelopmental, like how they're doing in school, how they're interacting socially, right? With other kids, like in school. Because on top of like the pulmonary, renal, and cardiovascular effects we were talking about earlier, and, premature birth can cause differences in the central nervous system because a lot of your brain development happens third trimester. So I've read studies where, the brains of preterm babies are different. They're just different because a lot of your brain development happens third trimester. So, ASD, they're at increased risk of ASD, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, intellectual disabilities, ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So I think parents can be really mindful and really monitor their kids' milestones. Like, okay, they're doing well in school, but how much effort and time are they spending? I mean, even if you're bringing the grades, great, but at what expense? Like, if you're a kid, a healthy thing is that you're going out and playing and only spending 2 hours on homework instead of, 8 hours or like 5 hours, you know what I mean? So really seeing how they're balancing like their schoolwork with just other things, just being a kid.
Yeah. Wow. Well, looking back, it sounds like you went through some really hard times, especially what you were saying about this feeling of being different and not knowing where you fit in your community, and not really understanding why you were different until you get much older. So if you could go back into that point in your life when you're a kid, maybe a early teen, and you're struggling to find your place in the world, it sounds like you have found it now, and like what an incredible journey to get there. So if you could go back in time to that moment when you don't know what your place in the world is, with everything you've been through and learned since then, are there any words of advice that you would bring your younger self back through time?
I think be accepting of yourself, even if around you, if, your community, your family, your friends may not understand exactly, they may not understand you and your struggles, but be kind to yourself. That would be, the first lesson. And I know back then I was hard on myself, right? Still till this day, in certain things I am hard to myself, but I think with, focusing on my mental health and just being proud of my accomplishments, I've become kinder to myself and be like, okay, nobody's perfect. And yes, strive for perfection, but also be kind for yourself and forgive yourself. We're all human and nobody's perfect. And don't let your differences derail your confidence, because, where there's a will, there's a way, and don't give up. Like, for me, it was very hard. Like, what if, going into pharmacy, I'm like, okay, what if I can't make it? But I think just, being mindful that we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and, to really cater your life, around your strengths. I think that's vital.
Wow, that's great advice for anyone. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Preeti, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. What an incredible journey you've been on, unlike anything that we've ever talked about on the podcast. I'm so thrilled that you were connected to us. Thank you so much to Ami for sending Preeti our way. Just a really incredible story that I'm so honored to be able to share. Please tell our listeners where we can go to connect with you online. If you have any public advocacy or anything like that you'd like to share, please let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listeners and viewers can follow me on my Instagram handle at pculva33. Also, as I mentioned before, I do a lot with South Asian mental health, but of course, we're open to a diverse group of individuals. So you can follow us. Our nonprofit organization is called We Are Saath. So Saath means together in Hindi. So we are together, essentially. So it's called We Are Saath, and also We Are Saath Chicago. If you're in the Chicago area, you can follow us on Instagram at We Are Saath and We Are Saath Chicago. And also, if you're interested in doing, advocacy for preterm birth, March of Dimes, you can follow them on Instagram. And then also, there's an organization for adult preemies, the Adult Preemie Advocacy Network. I do know the founders. I haven't really started that much work with them, but I intend to. So they're also they're first of its kind adult preemie advocacy network. So for those of you that want to learn more about premature birth and its implications in adulthood, you can follow them as well.
And I know before we started recording, you have sent over this link of journal articles that you've put together, some really incredible work. So if anyone wants to check that out, I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And if you could tell us a little bit about it, what sort of resources have you collected?
Yeah, so actually the research paper links, it's through the Adult Preemie Advocacy Network I was talking about earlier. So they've actually put together like a bunch of research papers. And they're based in the UK, and I came across it during my research, but it goes into really how premature birth has the impact. Like they sorted it according to systems like GI, neurology, cardiovascular effects, etc. So that's great. And I also found a couple of studies on my own that I can send to you, Jesse. That Cleveland Clinic Journal of Medicine article that really goes into like, it shows like, it's a good summary of like the long-term effects of prematurity that they found in that study. And that there was another one I found with the Journal of JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, and talking about how socially premature birth can impact actually sexuality and parenthood.
Wow.
So, which I know I didn't mention earlier in the other podcast segment, but so that it's not just the physical and neurodevelopmental, but also socially how premature birth can impact an individual. So yeah. I'll send you a link to that as well.
Awesome. This sounds like a great bunch of resources, and I'll put links to all that in the show notes for the episode. Well, thank you so much. You've done an amazing job on the show today. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us and sharing your incredible story.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm so privileged, and thank you so much for giving the opportunity to share my story with the world. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Major Pain. I'm Jesse Mercury, your host and the producer of this podcast. Artwork by Egg Salad Salad. Our theme music is the song Time Machine from my synth-pop album Sci-Fi, now streaming everywhere. Support this show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all at Major Pain Podcast. If you have questions or comments you'd like to share with myself, our guests, or our listeners, send an email to majorpainpodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about this show, support its creation, or comment on any episode at majorpainpodcast.com. Major Pain is supported by our listeners on Patreon. Thank you to our $2 per month supporters, our $7 per month patrons Naomi Adele Smith, Sonny Roberts, Kelsey Matson, Alexandria Henderson, Justin Minnick, Laura Stevens, Heather Muncie, and Robert, and our $25 per month producers Steve Kavanaugh, Chris Fowler, Trish O'Brien, and Hipster Leia. Learn how you can support this podcast while receiving special recognition on the show, gifts, and monthly bonus episodes at patreon.com/majorpainpodcasts.